The problem with CIA is they don't tell their own story sometimes. It's one of the problems. They do so many things that help us that they can't talk about. And that's a frustration for me as a journalist, because sometimes you'll hear about things. There'll be an example that I think listeners will really appreciate is the Taylor Swift concert that was almost attacked in Vienna over the summer. It was a big concert planned in Vienna, and there was an ice plot to have a terrorist attack on the concert. And the American CIA...
Now, when you say we knew where they were, we had gotten that information, how did you ever find out, like, how we uncovered that? Was that all just using, like, massive data sets on satellite imagery, or were there sources on the ground? Like you said, some of them were, like, fessed up to at least some of it, but before, it sounded like you meant before even we got that, we knew where a lot of these things were.
Yeah, and that's an important story, I think, to tell, because the way we understood why we understood Syria's program and where things were and what they made is because we had one of the best spies in the world working for us inside their operation. And so in the start of the book, there's a story about this Syrian chemist who was actually trained in the United States. He'd gone to the United States on a scholarship as a kid, so he really liked Americans, and lo and behold, when he grew up and became a scientist, he went to work making sarin for Assad. That was his job.
That's what we trained him for.
That's what we trained him for. He had a really good chemistry degree, so he went to work in Syria and started making this stuff for a living. And at some point in the 80s, he decided that he needed to tell the Americans what he was doing. And there's complicated reasons. He ended up getting a lot of money for us, for one thing, so he got financially rewarded quite a lot. But over 14 years, this is a long time to run a spy, he would pass information to the Americans about what the Syrians were making and how much and where they were making it, and even gave them samples. And one of the reasons we had such a really good idea of what Syria's sarin looked like, because he gave us some. He actually handed it over to a CIA officer at his house one day in the middle of Damascus, said, here's a little present for you. It's Christmas time, a little bit of sarin for you to take home. And there was this whole operation where they had to smuggle it out of the country, send it back to the U.S. for testing. But the Americans knew everything about Syria's program before the war started by a long shot. And the spy, the poor guy who helped us, ends up betraying himself. He trips up during an interrogation. He's getting asked about some corruption that he was involved in, and he thinks that his bosses are coming after him because they found out he'd been spying. So he confessed to the whole thing, and he was taken out back and shot, basically. And so that was the end of our spy. But for 14 years, it was one of the most sensitive operations in the intelligence community. It was so secret that not even the White House was getting regularly briefed on it, and it was because they just didn't want anybody else to find out about this super secret spy they had.
I get that. I understand the world is a very gray place and that spycraft is incredibly secretive. The slippery slopes, though, of literally the President of the United States not getting read in on something that highly sensitive, though, is pretty wild.
Yeah.
Do you ever think about that?
I do. And sometimes it's just that, President's got a lot of things on his plate. This is not at a point where we feel it's relevant for him to have to know this, but you do wonder what else the president is it told about, because was it 20,000 people work for the CIA? They're all doing interesting things, and that a lot of those operations aren't briefed until it comes to a point where they have to brief him. So that's just the way it works.
Yeah, this is the stuff that keeps me up at night, though, because I think about it, because it's like, I get it. You got to live in a secretive world, but we see what happens when that goes wrong.
Yeah. Because
then you have effectively unelected people making the hardest decisions on behalf of the American people that in some cases are objectively very, very bad. And they may think, well, there's a reason behind a reason behind a reason that, we know here.
Yeah. And that's always usually the case. It's not, one thing you get to understand about intelligence when you really get to know people is they're very ordinary. I mean, they have I live in suburban Washington. All around me are people that work in intelligence jobs. I mean, people in my swimming pool. I have the community pool. Some of them are they work for the intelligence community, and so they're essentially guys trying to do a job, and their interest for the most part is trying to figure out ways to protect us from things that we don't even know about and think about. But that is a big responsibility, and sometimes they can do things, they can build things that the White House may or may not be cleared on. So that's where it starts to get into that slippery slope territory. And we've certainly seen in the past where, CIA decided, well, this leader of this country should go.
Yes.
And we're going to help get rid of him because we think he's bad for us, not because he's bad for the people in that country necessarily, but he's bad politics or, bad strategically for the United States. And so they'll help, support a coup. And that's happened so many times in our past.
That's right.
So, you do wonder sometimes that the ability to do things doesn't necessarily mean that you should do them. And
That's
if
right.
there's no oversight, there's nobody looking over their shoulder to say, well, this may not be a good idea, you should think twice about this, then, that's a problem.
And that's why I understand where some of these conversations start with people like, oh, did the CIA do this? I try to live on the best evidence we can get.
Yeah.
That's why I like good reporting where people really dig into it, and nothing's ever 1,000%, but like you get as close as you can. And I try to look at things empirically on a case-by-case basis, because what happens is we've developed these emotions towards organizations like CIA based on some of the things that they have provably done in the past, like overthrowing governments that shouldn't have been overthrown and causing wars that shouldn't happen. What that doesn't mean is that every single time something like this happens in the future, it's them.
Yeah.
Like the world can be both things at a different time.
And the problem with CIA is they don't tell their own story sometimes, is one of the problems. They do so many things that help us that they can't talk about. And that's a frustration for me as a journalist, because sometimes you'll hear about things, there'll be an operation against North Korea, or some kind of jamming or cyber information to stop an Iranian plot. Or an example that I think listeners will really appreciate is the Taylor Swift concert that was almost attacked in Vienna over the summer. There was
This past summer.
There was a big concert planned in Vienna, and there was an ISIS plot to have a terrorist attack on the concert. And the American CIA helped to thwart that, so it never happened. And the
do you know how they did this?
It's a lot of it still hasn't come out. We're working on that story. I can say that we're actually working on it pretty hard right now to kind of give. We have to be careful, because obviously there are sort of operational details that we'll probably never know, and it wouldn't be necessarily in our interest to know exactly how, what source provided the tip, because if we report that there was an informant in a certain town and describe him, then that person could be targeted and killed. So that's something we wouldn't want to happen.
Sure.
But the fact that something of that magnitude was planned, and think about the casualties that could have been, that could have resulted from an attack, and how that was thwarted, that was just pretty extraordinary. And again, the CIA there's been only one public mention, just a throwaway line by a CIA official at a speech, who kind of said, well, that concert, that thwarting of that plot, that was us. But that's all that's been said publicly about it, so we don't know exactly how they found out.
Is that how you first got a hold of it being a story, just that throwaway line?
We had heard things indirectly from others, and that throwaway line was the confirmation that, this was something. The Americans were deeply involved in this. And we found out since then that that other countries were involved too. There was sort of like there are several close allies that we share a lot of stuff with. And this is one of those that kind of got bounced around into several different countries, and people were looking at the evidence to see what we might do, or how, how serious it was. And it turned out to be a fairly significant plot with like 4 or 5 different actors.
And ISIS, you said it's ISIS.
ISIS inspired. ISIS was communicating with people. We think ISIS was involved in the choice of target, because huge, high-profile American entertainer at a massive concert that was planned for Europe, and it would have been, if you can imagine, if it had been successful, how we'd still be talking about that now.
Are we talking about bombs?
Talking about, there were bombs and there were other things, and it's and again, this is part of the reconstruction work that we've been working on, and I won't say more than that because it's a competitive story, but we think there's a lot to it, and the individuals who are involved, at least one of them was radicalized because of Gaza. He was watching stuff going on in the Middle East and thinking that he wanted to act out in some way. And so guys like that are very susceptible to messages from people like ISIS that say, look, you have to you have to take action. You have to take a stand against this stuff.
When you say something like we had heard about this indirectly, obviously without revealing direct sources or things like that would get you in trouble, can you just explain what that means when you say that?
Sometimes it's like it can start out as a secondhand conversation that somebody will say, "Look, this guy is my friend. I'm friends with somebody who's working on this case, and I can't tell you much about it. He won't tell me much about it, but I can tell you that there's something going on here. And if I were you, I'd look into this. This is really," so that's how these things get started. Sometimes it's very indirect. CIA doesn't put out press releases saying that, we did this, that, and the other. They never put out press releases about much of anything. They're very, self-contained in terms of
CIA secretive. Come on.
I used to cover them, which was like the hardest beat in the world because, if you cover Pentagon or State Department, there are like whole teams of press people, and all they do is like put out press releases or provide information. You call them with a question, they send somebody to research it, they get back to you with an answer if they can. It doesn't happen like that with CIA. It's the most they can do most of the time is to steer you away from something that's just wrong.
Yeah.
And
they give you a guest pass at Langley?
Yeah. Well, if you go there, yeah, they do. Yeah. Well, if you go for visits and meetings, and if you cover the agency, you do get to go, for briefings sometimes. If you can arrange one, if you can make an argument that, look, I'm working on a story about chemical weapons, and here's what I've found, and I'd love to have a discussion with your folks who are interested in this subject. And that sometimes can lead to a meeting, and it's I must say, a very cool place to visit, because you walk in the door, and first thing you see is this huge CIA seal that's on the floor. It's part of every movie that's ever made about CIA. It's this big seal, and then on the wall is this big display of stars. Each star for each CIA officer was killed in the line of duty, and some are named, and some have names they're forever withheld because they had secretive jobs and their identity was secret. So it's just like a blank space on the book next to them. But behind all that is this one of the coolest museums that you'll ever see in your life if you have the privilege of seeing it. And that's not many people. But CIA basically has its collection of stuff from 50 years of operations around the world. And it's everything from somebody's, communication device hidden in a pen or in a shoe or something during Cold War times to literally Osama bin Laden's gun that was hanging on the wall of his house in Abbottabad when the SEALs broke in. And there it is right there where you can see it. And so all the swag and all the cool stuff that they've gotten from operations around the world is in this little spy museum.
And that's the stuff they can show you.
That's the stuff they can show you.
Stuff they can't.
There's things that are hinted about on the display that you just wish you could get the whole story for.
Yeah. So you were literally on, like, it was called the CIA beat.
Yeah, or intelligence beat, we call it. But that's sort of the CIA is the main agency we cover.
There's the mushrooms here again. Feed them shit, keep them in the dark. Let's go.
And it's intimidating for somebody who's come into it cold, as I did in 2007 when I first got the job.
Oh, what a year!
I know. It's unbelievable because that was all the stories that the CIA didn't want to talk about at all, like black site prisons.
I just had John Kiriakou in here for 6.5 hours.
Yeah, I knew. In fact, I dealt with John when his story broke.
Yeah,
but that was not a time of warm relations with the CIA and the press. But yeah, it is such a fortress in terms of trying to get information and try to understand what they're doing that it takes a long time to get to the point where you feel like you have a handle on it. And it's until that point, you just feel completely lost.
Watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here